Haunted Homestead. Part 3 of this story. Well, not the part 3, but it's where I stopped at part 3. We'll leave off on page 12. I have to handle this book gingerly, as I've stated before. We danced in the dining room through all the Christmas night, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning before we separated. Again, when I was about to retire, Mrs. Laguerre came to accompany me. "I hope you rested well last night, my dear Agnes, though I have scarcely had an opportunity of asking you today," she said, as we entered my room. "I did not wake until dawn, ma'am," I answered evasively, for I had determined, since they let me into no confidence upon the subject of the household mystery, to keep my own counsel in regard to my dream and the open door. "You slept until dawn, that is well. I hope you will have as good a rest for the few remaining hours of the night. Good evening, my dear. Lock your door after me," said Mrs. Laguerre, going out with a look of relief and satisfaction. As upon the evening previous, I turned the key upon my retiring hostess, listened until I heard her pass out, and secure the hall door, then searched my room, undressed, said my prayers, and went to bed. As I hinted in the beginning of this narrative, nature had made me at once superstitious and fearless. In the supernatural I believed without trembling, and now alone in this supposed to be haunted chamber, I lay with an interest devoid of uneasiness, waiting the development of events. It was near day when, overcome with watching, I fell asleep, and then, as upon the night previous, I had a vision or dream, as you please to call it. Methought the sound of a deep sigh awoke me. When looking up, I saw, standing in the middle of the room, the fearful woman of my dream. Her finger pointed downward to the same spot, and still pointing thus, she receded backward until she disappeared through the open door. I started up to call her, and with the violence of my effort, awoke to see the morning light shining in through the shutters that I had neglected to close, and to hear little Jet letting herself in at the hall door, to come up and light my fire. Hey, Jim Morrison. Again, on entering and seeing the open door, she cast an uneasy, suspicious, frightened look around her, and said, "Yer allus gets up and open this door when yer hears me a-comin'?" "Don't yer, Miss Agnes, ma'am?" "Yes, I heard you coming, Jet," I replied evasively, but the answer satisfied my simple little maid, who went cheerfully about her tasks. As it was not early, I hastened to my toilet and descended to the dining room, not to keep my kind hostess waiting breakfast. They were all ready to sit down when I joined them, and we immediately took our seats at the table. Upon my plate I found a letter from my brother, which I asked and obtained permission to open and read. It was a regretful refusal of my invitation to him to join me at Wolf Break to spend the holidays, upon the ground that he had brought home with him a friend whom he could not leave. "Pooh, let him bring his friend along. Tell him so. Any friend of your brother will be welcome here, Agnes," said Mr. Laguerre, to whom I communicated the contents of my letter. I acted upon this permission and wrote for my brother to come and bring his friend. After I had finished and dispatched my letter, I joined the party, who were going out to dine. The dinner was followed by a dance, and the dance by a moonlight sleigh ride home. But through all the excitements of the day, the image of the dark woman haunted my mind. And again, it was very late when I retired to bed. As usual, Mrs. Laguerre and Mathilde saw me to my room, and as before I locked the door behind them, and listened until I heard them leave the house and secure the hall entrance. Then I hastened my preparations, got into bed, and thoroughly worn out with fatigue and loss of rest, soon fell into a deep sleep. And a third time the dream or vision passed before me. Methought I was awakened by a voice calling my name. I opened my eyes and saw, First the door stretched wide open, and then, standing in the middle of the floor, the beautiful and majestic woman of my former visions, but this time more sad and stern in aspect than before. Fixing those wild, mournful eyes upon mine and holding my gaze, as it were, by a mesmeric spell, she slowly and severely pointed to the spot beneath my feet, and saying, as it were, "Look," passed in measured steps from the room. Once more in agony, I started up to call and stay her, but with the effort I awoke. The door that I had carefully locked stood wide open as before. It was the same hour as that of my awakening upon the 2 previous mornings. The day was flushing redly up the eastern horizon beyond the mountains, and nature was awakening everywhere. I could not now so readily shake off the influence of my dream. There was something that I wished to ascertain before my little maid should interrupt me. The reiterated gesture by the woman of my dream determined me to examine the spot upon which she had stood and pointed, to see if really her action had any meaning. So I arose from my bed, and first securing the door and turning the key straight in the lock, that my little maid, should she come, might not spy my doings, I removed the hearthrug, took a pair of strong scissors, drew out the tacks, and turned up the carpet. Reader, I had no attraction to the supernatural, but a mortal antagonism to the horrible, and nearly swooned on seeing the spot to which the dark woman of my vision had pointed deeply, marked with the sanguine crimson stain. The very heart in my bosom seemed frozen with horror, and I felt myself as if I were turning to stone, when a loud knocking at my door aroused me. It was my little maid, whose coming I, in my deep and fearful abstractions, had not heard. I hurriedly replaced the carpet and the rug and went and opened the door. "Your sleep sound this morning, Miss Agnes, ma'am," said little Jet, smiling as she entered. "I feared I scared you out in your dreams," she added, noticing, I suppose, my horror-stricken face. "You certainly startled me, Jet," I said evasively, and while she lighted the fire, I returned to bed to try to compose my nerves. Between the horror I felt at the idea of sleeping another night alone in an accursed room where it seemed the crime had been committed, and my intense desire to elucidate the mystery, I was at a loss how to act. Only one thing I decided upon: to keep my own counsel for the present. "The fire is burning fuss rate now, Miss Agnes, so you can get up and dress if you likes, as breakfast is most ready," said my little attendant. And taking her hint, I arose and hastened. Oh, don't want to rip the pages. Very fragile book. And hasten. Oh, this is still not the right page. Oh, these pages don't want to separate. And hastened my toilet in order to be punctual at the morning and meal of my hostess. As I descended the stairs, I heard Mrs. Laguerre speaking to her daughter in the parlor, where a fire was kindled every morning while there were visitors in the house. She was saying, "I tell you, Mathilde, it is all a delusion. Those who have never heard the story never see or hear or fancy anything unusual. You know now Agnes has not been disturbed, and it is because she has heard nothing. Whereas if you had told her this history, she would have imagined heaven knows what, all sorts of horrors. That is the reason I wished her to hear nothing of it. She has slept undisturbed in that room. Let that be known. Others will then not object to do so, and the report will die out." She spoke in a quick, low tone, and seeing me coming, instantly changed the subject. But my sense of hearing, always acute, was quickened by intense interest, and I heard more than she would have wished me to know. She turned to me with a smile and said, "I hope that you have rested well, my dear Agnes." I said, "As well as usual," and receiving Mathilde's morning kiss, took her arm and accompanied him. I can't read right now. I said, "As well as usual," and receiving Mathilde's morning kiss, took her arm and accompanied them into the breakfast room. It was some hours after breakfast that day when I went up into my chamber to write letters. While thus engaged, I heard Mathilde coming up, singing, and enter a chamber corresponding to mine, but separated from it by the front hall. Are you there, Agnes? She asked. Yes, dear. Shall I come to you? S'il vous plaît, mademoiselle, she answered gaily. I went into the room, where I found Mathilde directing Jet in her work of preparing the chamber for guests. I shall have to put your brother and his friend here together to sleep, my dear Agnes, as we are so full. But, by the way, who is his friend? This is just what I cannot tell you. John, in his wild, careless way, simply said that he had a friend with him, as a reason why he could not at once accept your father's invitation. And Mr. Laguerre as carelessly and frankly wrote back for him to bring his friend along with him. Eh bien, c'est l'ami inconnu. Sorry, no Frenchman. Must be content to lodge with John. We can do no better. Since your house is not so large as your heart, chère Mathilde. Little Jet was engaged in removing the fire screen, preparatory to lighting the fire to air the room. As she set this board down before my eyes, I could scarcely repress the cry that arose to my lips. It was an old, faded family portrait that had been put to this use. That was not much, but it was the portrait of the dark woman of my dream. The same midnight eyes and hair, the same proud, stern, sad brow. Whose likeness is that, Mathilde? I asked when I had in some degree recovered my composure. Oh, I don't know. It is a portrait of some member of the family of the former proprietors, I suppose. We found it here with other rubbish, considered, I suppose, of too little value to remove after the Vandervaans left. I washed its face and set it up for a fire screen to such vile uses, etc. By the way, look at it. It is a very remarkable countenance. Such expression might have been that of Semiramis when ordering the execution of Ninus. See how dumb we are these days? I have no clue who those two personages are. No, I do not think so. There is no wickedness in this face. There is strength, sternness, perhaps cruelty if necessary. I replied, still studying the portrait. Who could it have been? I know not. Indeed, some old member of the Vaughan family. Nay, I do not think the portrait is of such ancient date. To be sure, it is dilapidated, but that seems to be more from abuse than from time. And observe, the costume is modern. So it is. I had not thought of that before. Well, now, since you have said so, I begin to surmise that this may be the portrait of Madeline Vandervaughan. And who was she? I inquired, with as much indifference as I could assume. Oh, the last lineal descendant of the elder branch of the family, and the last heiress of this old estate. She married her first cousin, Wolfgang Vandervaughan. And what was her history and her fate? I inquired, striving to restrain the betrayal of the intense interest I felt. Oh, her history was as painful as her fate was tragic. And, well, hush, there is someone coming. I'll tell you another time. It was Mrs. Laguerre who entered, and smiling a sort of salutation to me and opening the letter she held in her hand, said, My dear Mathilde, we are to have more company. Your cousin Rachel Knowles is coming. She will be here this afternoon. Oh, I should be so glad if we only had room for her, exclaimed Mathilde impulsively, and then she blushed deeply in having spoken thus freely of their crowded state in the presence of a guest. My dear Mathilde, said I, as mine is a double-bedding chamber, I should be very happy to have Miss Rachel for a roommate. That is, if it would be agreeable to herself. Thank you, Agnes, dear. Agreeable? Why, it would be the very thing. Rachel Knowles is the greatest coward that ever ran, and would no more sleep in a strange room by herself than she would in a churchyard. If you had not kindly offered, some of us girls would have to take her in, although we are all sleeping double now. But are you sure, my dear Agnes, that you will not be incommoded? Kindly inquired Mrs. Laguerre. Incommoded? Is that the word, incommoded? Not in the least. The arrangement suits me to a nicety, I replied. And so in truth it did, for let for let me confess that while I could not prevail upon myself to shorten my visit and leave the house with its great mystery unsolved, the prospect of sleeping alone in that chamber cursed with crime appalled me. But in company with a companion of my own age, it would be a very different affair. That horrid portrait. Take it into the attic, Jet, said Mrs. Laguerre, as her eyes fell upon the ci devant fire screen. The little maid took up that picture and carried it off as commanded. Then there was a visit of inspection and preparation paid to my room. Fresh sheets and more blankets were put upon the second bed, fresh napkins laid, and then mother and daughter and little maid departed. Through the remainder of that day, I had no further opportunity of learning from Mathilde the history of the Dark Lady. And then we'll pick up next time on this sentence. Late that afternoon, Uncle Judah. Page 16, we will commence. Goodbye. Boo!